alive. It increases the heart rate. It makes our breathing a little bit more rapid. It brings us into like a mobilized state where we're ready to like fight or flight. You often hear of those trauma responses. That's really coming from the brainstem. It's like, okay, how do I respond? Even actually taking a step back prior to that, the other thing that's kind of happening in the background all the time is our amygdala, the part of the brain that's really responsible for um, fear. It's kind of thought of like this, the fear center, but it's really there scanning our environment all the time, trying to decide, is this safe or is this dangerous? So when the amygdala sees something, it's not that the amygdala says something traumatic is happening, but it's like, whoa, danger, threat. Need to prioritize the brainstem, and kind of mobilize into this like fight or flight kind of response. So when that process is happening, the other thing that's happening is that our brain is essentially deprioritizing other functions that are not important in that moment.
Right.
So, for example, the prefrontal cortex. I point here because this is kind of where it is, and it's literally right here, like in our right, kind of under our forehead. This is responsible for decision making, choice making, rational thought. Um, I think some people sort of think about the prefrontal cortex is sort of our highest self in some way. It's like our ability to not just be ourselves, but like see ourselves.
Right.
So sort of responsible for all that like meta cognitive processes where I know how I'm feeling and how I'm thinking and then acting on that. That's not happening when we're in fight or flight, right? It's
Right.
this instinctual threat. I need to figure out like what I'm gonna do with this threat. And that's not coming from this place. And then the other thing that's happening is our hippocampus, which is responsible for moving, in part, it's responsible for taking what's happening in the moment and filtering it, deciding, does this need to move from like short term memory into long term memory? Well, the hippocampus is very sensitive to stress. When there is stress, it gets a little, I don't want to say dysfunctional, it doesn't feel fair, but
Right.
that's again, it's another part of the brain that is not prioritized when we're kind of in a fight or flight. So what that means is that our hippocampus isn't able to take what's happening now and process it like it would any other memory. So this is how you kind of later wind up with the quality that a lot of people talk about with trauma, where it feels like it never is really over. It's
Right.
like when I think about it, it's like, bam, it's like it's happening right now. That quality of it happening, that sense that it's happening right now, that's coming from, and that's coming from the hippocampus, because the hippocampus never took what was happening and said, oh, okay, I understand this, and I'm going to move this into long-term memory. Most things, if you think about like what I had for dinner 2 weeks ago, if I remembered that, if it was an emotional enough experience where I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll, turn this into a long-term memory. The
Mhm.
hippocampus is the thing that gives us that quality that actually happened 2 weeks ago. That understanding that when I think about that dinner, I'm not having that dinner now. It happened 2 weeks ago. So I think this is very common in survivors. You'll hear them say it's like I can't get over it, or like it's happening now all over again, right? When it's activated.
Right. I,
The other thing that happens, and this is a little bit more, I think one way to think about in general the impact of trauma on the brain is that trauma fractures us in some ways. I don't mean like we're broken, but I mean because it's prioritizing the survival functions of our brain, um, we also are losing connection to. So, for instance, the cerebellum is this part of our brain that we sort of we kind of attribute it to being, some people call it like the peacemaker. It's kind of like the part of our brain that's responsible for modulating our emotions, our arousal. So the cerebellum is kind of in communication with all these different parts of the brain. And it's saying, oh, okay, like your heart beats kind of fast, but I'm also able to see that like nothing bad is happening right now. So I'm going to down regulate that heartbeat. All that communication is happening from the cerebellum and its communication with different parts of the brain. For people who've experienced chronic trauma, like many domestic violence survivors, that communication actually gets broken down because it's not present during trauma. And over time, actually, we see, I think in some of the brain imaging studies I've seen, that the cerebellum actually loses volume. It's a little bit weaker. So folks, trauma survivors can have a more difficult time connecting, for example, oh my gosh, my heart is beating very fast, but nothing bad is happening right now.
Right.
It's more of like, oh my God, my heart is beating very fast. Like, that's not good. Something bad is happening, right? There's a disconnect going on. Um, Same thing with the corpus callosum. This is a part of our brain that connects the left and the right hemisphere. That also gets smaller in people who've been exposed to multiple traumas. We lose that ability to really access quickly um, all of the information in our brain. And so we get kind of hyper focused and prioritize, even when we're safe, those
Right.
survival mechanisms, they're the ones that are used to firing up. And so they kind of get fired up more easily. And these other parts of the brain quiet down. And it's interesting. I mean, you can actually see this in studies of people with, complex PTSD or experience or chronic trauma. Um, that these parts, like the survival mechanism parts, they can be bigger, right, and then smaller, kind of in these more what we call the rational sort of decision making kind of brain, and then connecting everything together.
Oh, that's
I don't know, maybe that was more than you were looking for.
no, you're great. You're doing great.
Yeah.
I did have my producer tell me, so I'm just going to do this quickly. Evidently, we had a connective um, lag. So I just want to tell everybody, if you're just joining us, you may have missed my introduction to Rachel here. I want to be sure that people know that Rachel Stanton today. We're talking about you know. Abuse and how it affects your brain. Rachel is an LICSW, Rachel Stanton, and is trauma specialist and specializing in EMDR incentives, working with survivors around the world. I want to give her good bio that we did earlier. Backtrack a little bit. She has a master's in social work from Boston College and over a decade of specializing in trauma, particularly in sexual and child abuse. Rachel's dedicated her career to helping survivors reclaim their lives, and she teaches at the University of New Hampshire, educating future psychiatric nurse practitioners on trauma and dissociation. So, yes, so we welcome you to this episode of Through the Eyes of Survivors. We're sorry, I didn't realize we had that connective issue, but we're glad you're joining us. It reconnected just as you started talking about our first question, Rachel. So
Oh, good. Okay, good.
but I wanted to backtrack and give everybody your background on what we're discussing today. Um, so you were talking about the key regions of the brain and how that's affected by abuse. Yeah, and I think we had a couple of comments real quick in here about this is simply a coping mechanism for the brain. Is this reversible? Is a question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think sometimes I worry a little bit when I talk about, the impacts of trauma on the brain. It sounds so dire, and I don't want to like minimize the impacts. But the wonderful thing about the brain truly is that it's rewiring all the time, you know? And so even, yes, does our brain change when trauma happens? Absolutely. Our brain also changes when healing happens. Our
Yes.
brain changes when we have a new, dish in front of us that we try and it's really, really good. And we say, oh, now I know I like fish or something. It's like our brain is changing all the time. And so I think that there's value in understanding how it changes under trauma.
Hmm.
But also, um, our brain is kind of, I think, a way to think about it is almost like a muscle. So the parts of it that you use a lot are gonna get bigger and strengthen, and that'll kind of be like our go-to response is going to be to use those bigger muscles, and the ones we don't use, they get a little bit smaller. Just like muscles, right? We can work on those other parts of the brain. We can exercise those other parts of the brain, and we can use them, and they can get just as big. They can get just as strong.
Right.
Kind of, in using this analogy. So that's the wonderful thing is that really and truly, our brain does not stop changing until we die. This is a lifelong process of our brain kind of prioritizing one thing over another thing, getting stronger in this, weaker in that. That's totally normal. Yeah.
Yes, it's amazing how the body works and how we're designed to be able to heal ourselves in many ways.
Yes.
Um, so if your brain has experienced, prolonged long-term abuse,
Yeah.
um, what can that healing process look like?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it can vary, right? So I'm going to talk in generalities.
Okay.
When somebody has experienced prolonged, chronic trauma, your very first step is literally, I kind of think about it from like a first aid sort of perspective, is to like stop the bleeding.
Right.
So it's getting to a place where you're safe, actually safe,
Mhm.
right? So I don't ever work with people who are in processing traumatic experiences when they are still actually going through it, right? Because they're not in a safe place. That's not the place where we do our healing. That's
No,
the place where we say, okay, stop the bleeding. How do I get to kind of a safe place? Um,
they're going to remain in kind of that survivor mode. They're not going to be able to,
oh yeah.
like you were talking about earlier, that flight and
Hmm. Hmm.
response, the whole response.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And that will continue too. Once they get into a safe place, the next task is actually experiencing a sense of safety.
Right.
Because, one of the things that's happening, I referred to the amygdala earlier. When people have experienced a lot of chronic trauma, our amygdala starts to do this thing, which is helpful when we're still in an unsafe situation, where it will perceive threats everywhere, even neutral things, even things that are safe. Um, the analogy I use for my clients is the amygdala is kind of like, looking out at a parking lot and all the car alarms are going off.
Right.
So
So they're
there's
like hyper vigilant. Right.
exactly, right? So there's this state of like, okay, something bad is happening kind of everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, so the next step is actually being able to start to quiet some of that and to experience a sense of safety in this moment. For some people, by the way, it's also like some people experience that sense of like, oh, it's like car alarms are going off everywhere. And some people have another response, which is more of like a numbing or dissociative kind of response,
Yeah.
where it's kind of like everything's quiet. I see no threats. It's like it's all threatening, but it feels like nothing.
Mhm.
And so for them, it's almost like you're kind of looking at, instead of like a calming, you're looking at almost like we call it sort of upregulating, sort of coming up to a sense of being able to experience and sense things, rather than being in kind of a numbed state.
Right.
So once you get to a place of safety, then we look at, well, how do we keep you here? Right? That's
Yes,
important.
absolutely.
There's a lot of this. This can be a phase where people are learning coping skills or learning how to manage anxiety. They might be kind of rebuilding life in some ways, learning, building more healthy connections with others, whatever a particular person needs. For a lot of people, this can look like also um, trying to get rid of addiction. So, substance use can be a really common way that people cope with trauma, or to cope with the symptoms like that, the legacy of trauma. And so, also looking at a place of addressing any addictions or things that need to be kind of focused on to be in a place of somewhat, um, being healthy and stable enough. When you get to kind of this baseline sense of safety and I'm okay in this moment, and you have that ability to kind of maintain it, even if things sort of like shake you up a little bit, you can find within yourself a sense of like, but I'm okay. That's when we start to focus on processing the trauma and what happened. Um, how that looks kind of depends on, what the modality is. Like you said, I do EMDR. There's a couple other forms of things I'll practice, like progressive counting. There's sensory motor psychotherapy. There's a few modalities, but essentially what these things are doing is working with our brain in processing what happened and moving those traumatic experiences into long-term memory.
Okay.
So it's not like it didn't happen, but it takes on the quality of like, yes, that happened. It happened 2 years ago. It happened 5 years ago. It happened, and it's over now. And it's a felt sense of it's over. It's not like I'm having to tell myself it's
Mhm.
over. Um, and I think sometimes after that process, people also have a grieving process, right? There's in
Absolutely.
trauma processing, right? We're like often processing what did happen, but then sometimes after that, we have to process what didn't happen, you
Right.
know? And that's another kind of big phase of the work for some folks.
Yes. And in many of those cases, do a lot of people have, like, in your just in what you've experienced in helping others, is it common to have gaps in the memory sometimes, or gaps in there that people have to fill in to help
Abs-
them come to that kind of a realization?
yes, absolutely. So you don't necessarily have to be able to fill them in, but gaps in the memory, for trauma are totally normal. And if you think about it, kind of, we were talking about when something bad happens, your brain is prioritizing, these different trauma survival like responses. It's not prioritizing, let me remember each detail of this thing.
Mhm.
I mentioned the hippocampus. The hippocampus plays a big role in our like narrative memory of what happened. So that's like there was this beginning, and then this happened, and then there was a middle, and then there was an ending. Like the hippocampus kind of makes sense and puts things in a context like that.
Yes.
Not disrupted in trauma. So in trauma, what you'll find is many people, their memories will be fragmented,
Mhm.
or fractured, kind of going back to that, using that word, is that it might be like just like a smell. I just remember a smell, or I just remember a face. There's just these certain things that our brains are prioritizing in that moment to remember for survival, what we're kind of hyper focused in on in that moment.
Mhm.
And that's what we remember. It can be very difficult for people to piece together a story.
Right.
Um, this is, by the way, one reason why it drives me crazy when people will sort of criticize folks, survivors, and they'll say, well, your story changed and your story.
Yes. Yeah.
That's normal, right? That's normal. We are all in any given moment just trying to piece things together.
Mhm.
And every time we open up a memory, just by opening it up and thinking about what happened, we actually change it. Every
Mhm.
human being across the globe does that. You're never going to tell the same story in the exact same way, twice. But also, what survivors are often trying to do when they're telling their story is they are filling in gaps that they don't remember to try to make it make sense. And that's not always a conscious, like, I'm going to fill in this gap, but it's like, well, this must be what happened because that's what would have happened in this situation, if that makes sense. So,
No, absolutely.
yeah, so gaps definitely exist, and when we're in the processing phase, there's ways that we can work with that, where we can still process the way that the body remembers what happened.
Oh, yes.
And so I think that's another key thing, is just because we don't have a narrative memory for something doesn't mean that our body doesn't remember. There's many different forms of memory, and one of the biggest sources of memory from trauma is implicit. So it's a felt sense of, like, I might not remember what happened, but I know that whenever I smell this scent, I tense up.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
that's an implicit memory. There's no story there, but we can actually process that tension that happens, right, when that smell comes up, and that works. That's good enough.
Right, right. And sometimes you're put into situations that I know that can uh, bring up memories that you may not have remembered. I know, I mean, this wasn't even from my abuse, but just in general, um, I went through back in 2010, we had a tornado come towards us and literally kind of went over our house. And I, my daughter and I, we could feel the house breathe and hear the windows busting, and things were flying, and
Yeah.
it immediately snapped into my brain a memory of when I was a child in a tornado, and I did not even remember it. And my mother was like, "Yeah, you were 4 or 5 years old."
Yeah.
And I just never all those years remembered that it happened. And I know there's certain things, even in my abuse, things like that happen.
Yeah.
And that comes back into your brain, and you think, did that really happen?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's quite normal as well.
It is. And you asked that question. I think this is really common in a lot of my clients, where they will have a moment where they'll say, they did that really happen? Or
Yeah.
am I somehow making this up? Because it doesn't feel like other memories. It doesn't have the same quality of other memories. But that's not because it didn't happen or you're making it up. you know,
Right.
it literally just has a different quality
Mm-hmm.
in our brains. It's different from other memories. But also, the other things that I, will let people know is that the accuracy also isn't that important either in the healing process. So let's say you remember some detail about that tornado that isn't accurate.
Right.
But if you remember that feeling of, like, terror when you saw it coming, or you hear that noise and your body kind of braces,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's what you're processing, that reaction, that response in your body.
Right.
That's what you're healing. So that next time you hear that sound and you don't have that brace, or you sort of see that sight of a tornado. Well, if you see a tornado, I think you should,
Yes. Yeah.
that's right. But
Absolutely. Yes. I
yeah,
get what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah. So sometimes, I've worked with clients where, there will be a gap, but they just have a felt sense of, like, someone coming in my room at night, and then bad things would happen. We
Mm-hmm.
don't care what those things were that happened. I don't mean that in a cold way, but, like, we don't actually care about the accuracy. We care about the response that's happening in your body when you remember that.
Right. Right.
Because
'Cause, yeah, Chris,
that's the brain telling its story.
Yes, absolutely.
This is what happens.
Chris has put in the chat there about The Body Keeps a Score. That's a fantastic book if you haven't.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yes. I definitely recommend that. Bessel van der Kolk's the author of that, and he was here. He had a trauma center here in Boston for a while, or right outside of Boston in Brookline. But yeah, that book was actually one of the things that I read kind of early in my career and really inspired me to go into this work.
hmm No, and it's so true. I tell people all the time when I speak all across the country, you don't understand how much trauma your body will take on and affect different parts of you. Myself, being a survivor, yeah, there were certain aspects that affected me, but it really came to light when I lost my daughter to domestic violence.
Mm.
I tell people all the time, I absorbed the trauma so much, it literally attacked my own female development, and to the point of within a year and a half of her death, I had to have a hysterectomy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then in talking to other moms all across the country who had lost children,
Mhm.
whether it was domestic violence or not,
Yeah.
man, the majority of them had the same issue. And I lost my gallbladder also a
Yeah.
couple of years later, and again, that's the same issue. So, like the places your
Yeah.
body stores it from trying to help your brain relieve it, I really believe in that because I've seen and heard so many people across the country talk about that.
Yes. Yeah. These, it's funny you say this because a client and I were like having this discussion today that like these, we have sort of arbitrarily categorized the human experience into certain silos. There's like physical health that the medical people handle, right? And there's something like this psychological kind of mental health people handle, and then the spiritual and your religious people handle that,
Yeah.
and we kind of break things down. The thing is we just made that up. There aren't actually like these separate categories of so-called mental health versus physical health. We are just one being. We are just one being. And I think that it often will surprise people the very physical reactions they have when bad things happen, and I think we aren't as surprised by like the mental health aspect because we're used to thinking about it through that lens.
Mhm.
But the mental is the physical is the mental. We aren't separated like that into neat little categories.
No, no, and it's all tied together. It's definitely related.
Yeah.
Um, absolutely. We got a great question in here from Jim about, are the differences between what an abuse survivor and a soldier coming back from war, is that different in how the brain reacts?
Yes. I think that there can there can be differences here in thinking about particularly like what the triggers are going to be. So the thing about abuse is that it is happening in the context of a relationship.
Right.
That's different from other forms of trauma like accidents or war, right?
Mhm.
That abuse within relationships really impacts how we perceive, danger or safety in others.
Right.
And I think that's certainly true of war, right? If we're triggered and we start to think everybody's the enemy, I mean that process can still happen. But I
Mhm.
think it happens less so in the context of close relationships like it does for survivors. Where for survivors of abuse within relationships, it can actually feel dangerous to trust. It can feel dangerous to connect. It can feel dangerous to attach, because when I did that before, bad things happened.
Right.
And so they can kind of get stuck in a little bit of a loop, because actually our brain is very focused on attaching, very focused on
Yeah.
connecting. We are social beings, right? Like, we are all about connecting and attaching to each other. I think for soldiers, this is different. I don't see the same. I don't see the same kind of distrust when it comes to like intimate relationships, but
Right.
there can be more kind of existential sort of angst and a change in worldview, that like the world is a dangerous place, the world is a terrible place, or nothing matters. Kind of, this is almost like that numbing, extreme kind of numbing of like, none of this shit matters. But I think you don't see that playing out as much in the intimate relationships. I think it's more impacting that kind of larger worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's pretty incredible. Yeah. So, I guess let's see. What other questions I got here? How about how trauma disrupts motor function? Things
Oh,
like that. Yeah.
yeah. So actually, one of the things I referenced is sensory motor psychotherapy. So that's there's a woman, Pat Ogden, who's amazing. I recommend people Google her. She's awesome. She's a therapist, and she kind of created this model. And in sensory motor psychotherapy, one of the things that we're looking at is the way that trauma has impacted the body, which includes kind of our motor functioning and our ability to move. So I'm going to give you sort of an example of this.
Okay.
So when you were talking about the tornado, right? And you were saying not the like original memory, but the like 2010, was it 2010?
Yes.
The 2010 experience. So
Yes.
as you were talking about this, and I don't think you were conscious of this, you probably were not,
Right.
but your eyes got big.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of like you're seeing it now. It's like,
Yes, because I
oh,
can still remember, and I still even like, where is it? Every time I go to wash my car through certain car washes, the sound of the car wash and then the air blowing down the dry is very similar, and the windows go like this, and
yeah. No, see, there it is. Yes.
yes.
What's happening in that moment is you are re-experiencing it on some level, right? Like, you might still have some awareness here, that it's not happening right now,
Yeah.
but there's also a part of you where it is happening right
Right.
now. You remember it, it's activated, and your eyes get big, literally like you're seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
So, one thing that we like to kind of explore in sensory motor work is we conceptualize some of these things that are happening in the body when we're remembering something traumatic as a reaction or response to trauma that wanted to happen at the time but wasn't able to for some reason. So I'll give you an example of this. I was working with a client one time who was sitting, on my couch in the office, and she was sharing a story about, a store. She was in like a convenience store, and the place got robbed while she was in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was telling me about this, and as she was telling me about it, I'm going to see if I can do her legs here. So imagine like my hand here's the couch, okay, and then here's her legs. And so she's doing this thing that we often do. She, suddenly you just start seeing her leg kind of kick out.
Yeah.
Kind of kicking out, and she's telling me, and like, and then the guy comes in, and her legs start kind of going like this, and doing that thing. They sort of bounce up and down. You know how we can kind of do that.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things that as a sensory motor psychotherapist I've been kind of trained to tune into. because the way that we conceptualize that is, it seems like maybe there's something that the body wants to do right now, is
Right.
it's activated. So we kind of go through this process of just exploring, like, well, let's pay attention to what's going on in your legs right now as you remember, the guy comes into the store. Um, Long story short, where we got to was that what happened when the guy came into the store was her body froze. Very
Uh,
common trauma response, right? We
mhm,
kind of get stuck with that like deer in the headlights, kind of like, I don't know what to do.
mhm.
But what her body wanted to do was get the hell out of there. She wanted to run.
Right.
And so while that memory was activated and while we were talking about it, her body was trying to do that, right? Like
Mhm,
her legs are moving. They're literally trying to like run right now. And so, there's this whole way that we kind of work with that in that work. But what we did was we had her actually remember that memory and then let her leave the room so she could have that experience right here and now when that memory was activated of running away and being able to get away,
mhm.
which she wasn't at the time of the trauma. So what happens is, again, you're literally seeing the legacy of the trauma in the body. You are seeing, the lasting impacts of that, but also kind of what wanted to happen but wasn't able to happen for some reason.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is a good place to take a break. We're going to hear just a short word about our store, and then I'm going to get back with Rachel here, and we're going to get into all these great questions you have over here. So we'll see you in just a second. Okay. I realized all of a sudden as she was talking, the time clock came up, and I was like, oh, I think it's the yeah. Okay. No, you're doing really well, Rachel. It's
Oh, good,
all
good.
right. We're live again. So I'm here with Rachel Stanton, and we're talking about how the brain copes with trauma. So absolutely, I'd love to get to some of these questions in the chat. So Chris says, I developed a lot of issues with my central nervous system, and is it on I'm getting tongue tied.
Oh, autonomic,
Thank you.
autonomic.
I was getting tongue-tied. Nervous system after experiencing trauma as a child, and again, adolescence and adulthood. I'm with you there. With regards to DV survivors, have there been any studies on neurological issues developing post abuse? And as someone who has, how do you say that one? Is it dice?
I think it's dysautonomia. I think you say
Thank
nomia
you.
sometimes. Yeah.
Dysautonomia. Okay. Yeah. As someone who has those symptoms, they worsen during their DV experience. I've been curious about whether any studies have been done.
Mm,
So,
probably. Yes, probably. I will say this. I don't know that I've seen anything specific to DV survivors versus like, let's say general like trauma survivors and
right.
childhood abuse survivors. Um, but disorders in the nervous system are incredibly common in trauma survivors. And I think we're still at the beginning of our understanding of all the connections happening there. But I will share that many of my clients have these conditions that are related to the nervous system. I'm trying to think of POTS is one. The one that he named is one where there's issues with like heart rate, having a very, very fast heart rate or very, very slow heart rate. breathing issues. The nervous system regulates so much of our body, and the
Right.
nervous system is also what's involved in traumatic situations. It is the thing that helps us either to fight, flight, freeze, and as well, there's a few other trauma responses. But I
Fawn and yeah.
yeah, dissociate, submit. There's cry for help. But I think that um, when those systems are getting, I don't want to say overutilized, but overutilized in childhood, I definitely think that you are going to wind up with a nervous system that is wired for dealing with threats.
Right.
And that only becomes a problem when you are no longer dealing with threats, right? So if you grow up in a war-torn country, your brain is wired to live in a war-torn country. So it benefits your brain to be incredibly hypervigilant. It
Right.
benefits your brain to be very hyperactive and hyper aroused, we'll say, right? The problem is when you take sort of the person out of that situation, or things change and they're no longer in a war-torn country, and their body hasn't caught up to, oh, I'm safe now. So they're still reacting to everything, right, as if I am not safe, and the physical sensations that go along with not being safe are still going to be present. Um, and so you have people walking around with, a ton of anxiety and say, oh, I don't know why. I don't know why I'm so anxious. Everything's fine. But that nervous system was maybe wired at a time when it served them to be very much on alert,
Right.
to be very sensitive to changes in their environments and to threats. So yes, I think I will say in general, nervous system disorders go hand in hand with chronic childhood trauma. And I would guess there's going to be some connection specifically with domestic violence as well, just because that often is a chronic traumatic situation.
Yes, absolutely. Amanda says, how do you break the habit of saying sorry for everything?
Oh gosh. So, wow, what a good question.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon either. We
It's
see that
not.
amongst a lot of survivors. Even I went through a period of saying sorry for every little thing, especially
Yeah,
when I first got married.
yeah, yeah,
When I got remarried.
yeah, yeah. You know, so I think I kind of see the saris as it's a survival technique, right? It's a way of trying to attach and connect. Fawn is another kind of word, right? There's this survival strategy of really trying to connect with people and be good to them or for them so that they don't hurt us.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of sorries make a lot of sense in that context.
Mhm.
But then when the context changes and you don't, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of used it, I think, as a de-escalation technique on something that wasn't even escalating. So I was just kind of just putting it out there so that I was sure it wasn't going to go to the next level. So I was always, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I'm glad you share that because if you notice too, like the example you're using, what's happening first is that you're perceiving threat,
Yes.
right? So that's kind of the first thing. You perceive the threat, and then you're saying sorry, sorry to de-escalate.
Mhm.
But I think when most people say breaking the habit of saying sorry, they're talking about apologizing when there isn't an escalating situation.
Anything. That's what I was doing. There wasn't anything to escalate. And I would just be
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
I was waiting for the shoe to drop. I was like,
that's right.
ooh,
That's right. That's
kind of
right.
situation. So I just
Right.
get used to saying sorry for everything.
Gracefully. Uh-huh.
I don't want to hurt my feelings. I don't want to.
Yes. Yeah. So what I would say to that is I wouldn't worry about the sorries. The sorries are more of the symptom versus like a cause, if you will. I would say that we look at treating that um, that activation that's happening. The
Right.
reason why you're saying sorry is because you're scared that this person's mad at you. even though there's no signs, that they're mad at you. Your brain is picking up on something, right? You're triggered. And
Mm-hmm.
so your brain goes to, in this situation, this is a threat, and I've got to de-escalate it. And so I'm going to say sorry. Don't try to stop yourself from saying sorry. It's not going to happen. But if if you heal the trauma, which looks like you are no longer reading everything as a threat and experiencing everything as a threat, the sorries go away with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amanda followed up with, I feel like I'm a bother to others because of my past trauma where I was made to feel like everything was my fault.
Yes. Yeah. This is so normal. And I think there's an important, I was made to feel like everything was my fault.
Yes.
It's intentional, right? People, especially in domestic violence situations, but even in like parental and child or caregiver and child relationships, abusers will often point to the reasons why it's your fault
Mm-hmm.
explicitly. If you just did this, then I wouldn't have this reaction. It is, they're literally saying constantly it's your fault. And so it is normal to, when you've been hearing that over and over and over again, to come out of a situation saying, maybe it is my fault. Maybe I did do something wrong. Even if up here, it's probably not true. They tell survivors all the time that it's not our fault. It doesn't feel that way.
Right.
And that is completely normal. And that also, I think that also is similar to the sorries. I think that goes away again when you really look at healing the trauma.
Right.
So we don't necessarily need to focus on telling survivors, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. Although that's a great message and it's important, it's
Mm-hmm.
not actually going to change their minds. It's not going to change the felt sense of the experience that I am the problem, that there's something fundamentally wrong or broken about me, that this happened to me. But the good news is that that sense goes away on its own. When you've healed that trauma, you kind of drop that narrative. It changes. You're able to really see, oh, that had nothing to do with me,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in a way that's kind of coming from the inside rather than like externally.
Yeah, absolutely. Amanda, you're not alone. Definitely not alone in any of
Absolutely.
this.
Oh yeah.
And Jim says, surround yourself with people you don't have to say sorry to. Well, yeah, that's good. Getting people around you that you don't have to say that too, but just getting comfortable in your surrounding, in your own skin. I think a lot of it too has to do with like, because everything was so perceived your fault, you're just trying to control the narrative, a little bit. When you
Mhm.
have to say when you're sorry, you feel like you're taking some kind of control over the
Mhm.
situation when you feel like everything is all your fault.
Right.
And I think part of my own healing journey with this, and not everybody's the same, Amanda, but just trying to be sure that I can recognize the things that were absolutely not my fault, but be accountable to myself, not everybody else around there on anything that I felt I had responsibility.
Yeah.
So, and learning the differences because not everything we were responsible for.
That's right. That's right.
So, absolutely. And I think, was it some how to deal with baggage or triggers in someone you love that has experienced domestic violence, how to recognize what the real issue is. So they're asking about if you're with somebody who has these kind of triggers and stuff. How can you recognize it and help them deal with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think again, this is going to be probably generalizing. We're all sort of
Right.
individuals and need people to talk to us in different ways.
Right.
But I think there are ways of saying to people, in a way, in a loving, empathic way, I'm wondering if you're kind of responding to something else right now. Like, not saying like, oh, I think you're overreacting or you're, whatever. But
Right.
like I'm wondering if I'm triggering something in you right now. Like, do I sound like your mom, or am I like reminding you of your ex? Like a way of kind of gently noticing and getting a little curious about what's happening right now in this moment. Are
Mhm.
you kind of back there and then, or are you like here with me now?
Right.
So I think if you can help people in general, if you can help people sort of get curious, and you can start by being curious yourself, you can kind of get curious about like what's happening right now. Why does this conversation suddenly feel like a train wreck? It seems like things were kind of going okay, and then I said this
Right.
thing, and, it really exploded.
And you got to do it in just the right way, because you can't
That's
come
right.
back and go, "Oh, you're just equating me with my ex." You're going to trigger
That's
that person even more if you do it in that kind
absolutely.
of
That's right. It has to come from a place of like genuine curiosity,
manner.
and also like acceptance. Like, let's be honest, we all do this all the time.
Mhm.
I have a close friend of mine. She's kind of in the same. She's in the sort of same political party as I am, and we meet often. And she has these qualities that remind me of my mom. I love
Right.
my mom. But there's some of these qualities where I'm like the qualities that annoy me about my mom, and every once in a while I find myself responding to her with this irritation that doesn't really match. Like it's more of like I'm responding as if she's my mom kind of in this moment. We all do that all the time. Like,
Mhm.
we kind of say like, oh, that triggers this memory of this and that triggers this memory of that, and so like we also want to like normalize that way that we all can kind of suddenly what you just said reminded me of the thing that my ex just said, or said years ago, and suddenly it feels like my ex is standing in front of me now. Like we all kind of do that and have that experience, and it
Mhm.
does, and it's not a way to, we don't want to dismiss that as if it's abnormal or crazy.
No, absolutely not. One of my favorite stories I love to tell people all the time was during my first year of marriage. I could kick myself for it now, but my whole response to any kind of argument was flight in my
Mm.
new marriage, right? So if it's going to get too hot, too heated, whatever, I'm leaving.
Yes, yeah,
I'm leaving. And
yeah.
I would like, my kids were teenagers, and I'd be like, "Get in the car, we're going, I'm not staying," you know?
Yes, yes.
And put up with that for like a year. And after about a year, he finally went one day. He went, I was in there packing a bag, and he came in there and he pulled out a bag and started packing it. And I was like, "Oh no, you're not leaving. I'm the one who's leaving." He looked at me and he said, "If you're leaving, I'm leaving with you, because I
Mm.
don't have a home without you."
Oh my
All
God.
of a sudden, that made my brain, it
Mm,
did, in that moment go, "What are you doing?"
mm,
And I never did that to him
mhm.
again, not like
Yeah,
that, never,
yeah,
because I because it made the response kick in for me to realize I'm living out that previous
right.
trauma.
That's right.
And that's how he generally
Yes.
responded, and
Yes.
got
Yeah.
me to really thinking about it. And then we had a really good conversation over
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
We were able to have it then. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's such a lovely response. Like, I don't think you can ask for anything better in that sort of situation. I love that he joined you, right?
Yeah.
Like, he didn't come in and confront you and say, if you leave, I leave. He just kind of was like, okay, I'll start backing
Yeah,
too.
I was very like, ready to go too. I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, no, you did not." But he was very loving and responsive in that manner. So, yeah, absolutely. So how about for those who are struggling with PTSD or anxiety, what's
Mm,
some practical steps they can take to maybe start healing their brain?
yeah. Yes. So I am a big fan of therapy, right? So I'm coming from that lens. I also want to be really clear that trauma needs to be treated differently than other conditions.
Right.
So, regular talk therapy, CBT, these kinds of things work wonderful for people who are just experiencing depression or anxiety, kind of not related to trauma. These forms of therapy can really help us in times of crises, problem solving, all of this. When you have PTSD, and you've experienced either PTSD or complex PTSD, you need a different form of therapy because those other forms of talk therapy, they're engaging you right here,
Mhm.
right? But whenever this trauma is triggered, this part goes right offline. So that's why I don't know if you're familiar with DBT, but I used to be a DBT program coordinator. And we
Mhm.
used to express, and DBT is this dialectical behavioral therapy. And we teach a lot of coping skills, which are very important, like, ability to like regulate our emotions and tolerate distress. And people would say, Rachel, as soon as this thing happened, I didn't even remember what a coping skill was. That is not where my brain was. That was not what, I was not thinking in that lens. When I was triggered, it was fight, flight, freeze, or whatever, their kind of go to responses, dissociate.
Mhm.
Um, and so this is not to say that we can't over time learn these like coping skills. They're definitely helpful. But when you're looking at really healing, you need to seek out someone who really specializes in trauma therapy. And there's a number, it doesn't have to be EMDR, it doesn't have to be sensory motor psychotherapy. There's a number of things that work for trauma, but you need somebody who really specializes in that. This, um, it needs to be treated differently than other conditions for us to really heal. The good news is that um, it's possible to heal. And I think a lot of people don't know that. They think of PTSD or even complex PTSD as being like this chronic, lifelong condition. And it
Right.
really doesn't have to be that way. I think the reason why we have that idea is because people will sort of enter into, let's say, kind of regular talk therapy and do that for years and not really get better, or they'll get somewhat better and then like plateau.
Mhm.
And then the narrative becomes, oh, I'm truly broken. I've done therapy for 20 years and it hasn't worked. It's not going to work for me. I'm going to be living with this for the rest of my life, right?
Right.
That's not actually true. You just need you need the right modality, the right person, the right modality. So focusing on finding those people who really do like this is their work.
Mhm.
That is my advice. And also big fan of, again, EMDR. Progressive counting, sensory motor psychotherapy. There's been some cool stuff like brain spotting. There's other forms of it, but finding a good trauma therapist.
Absolutely, that can make a big difference.
Yes.
Absolutely. Let's see. I didn't see any other new questions in the chat. So let me see. I think we touched on, um, let's see. How about, can you break down the science of why some survivors struggle to leave abusive relationships even when they want to? They struggle leaving, but yet they can't. What
Mhm.
kind of the science behind what happens in your brain with that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's kind of two categories I would put this in. One is we have to remember the certain context that we are wired to attach and to connect with people. So we were referencing that earlier.
Right.
We have so many systems in our brain that are geared towards social connection. Our brain is not geared towards loss. Our brain does not understand loss. It does not understand disconnecting. No, it doesn't. It's
It doesn't. I
right.
still struggle.
No,
It's been
yeah.
12 years since the loss of my daughter, and it's very hard to.
Yes, yeah. We don't have a way to understand that. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense from the sense that we are, humans are social creatures, and our survival really depends on us connecting and being together. And other than that, we're a pretty vulnerable species.
Yeah.
There's safety in numbers, and we need to group up.
Yes.
So we are very much wired that way. From the moment we are born, we are looking to bond and to connect. Many people that are in domestic violence situations are with somebody, right, that they have bonded with, they have connected with, they have felt love for, they have felt lust for, they have felt attraction for. It is incredibly difficult for our brains to let that go and to disconnect. We are just not made for it. We are made to try to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this connection somehow, something's getting lost here. Let's try to connect more. You
Right.
know, am I doing something wrong? Let me try to fix it so that we can be stronger, so that we can be better. Maybe let me try to fix you so you can be better for me, right? Like all of that.
Let me try to fix you. Yeah, that
Yes,
didn't
let me
work.
try
That doesn't work.
exactly. Yes. So that is like the way that we are. All loss is hard. Even in situations where we're being harmed, our brain is still trying to hold on to that connection, that relationship. This is human nature. This is not something specific to survivors. This is all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other piece is that we were talking about some of those brain functions, like when we are traumatized over and over again, it does actually become harder for us to access our kind of decision making skills, our rational skills, and also remember I talked about how like trauma kind of fractures us. It makes different parts of our brain not communicate as well with other parts. So we can kind of over time lose that ability to keep that bird's eye view of what's happening here. And we get so in the moment with trauma and like, how do I survive this moment? That it can be hard to kind of keep this bird's eye like, do I still want to be in this relationship? Is this relationship doing, more harm than good? That all comes from here. And this is not as activated. It's not as not activated. It's not as um, when you're being traumatized. This goes quiet, and so it's harder to be able to make those decisions because you really have to be able to access that part of your brain.
Yes, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, Amanda says she appreciates this live. She really needed it. I'm going to look into
Yay!
because she needs help. Absolutely, Amanda. And also anybody else watching, so we do have a support line here at BTS. It's not a crisis line, it's a support line. We help you get resources, or if you just need a listening ear from other survivors. So you know that you aren't alone. The number is 1-855 BTS 1777, and it is open 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 7 days a week, Central Standard Time, and you can call or text. And if you need therapy and you're having a hard time finding those resources in your local area, the people on support line will help you find resources, and believe me, they're really fabulous at that. And they will keep plugging even if you have to call multiple times. If certain things don't work, they'll try another way to help you find those resources. So absolutely. Um, let's see. Oh, thank you, Audrey, for putting that in there. Audrey is one of our fabulous board members. Um, let's see. And Jim says, why do so many victims blame themselves? And are there methods to avoid or get out of the situation?
Mm. I think it's probably a complicated answer. Why
Yeah.
do we blame ourselves? But I think something I've said to clients before is that if you think about whether it's scarier to live in a world where bad things happen to us because of the things that we do versus bad things just happen,
Mhm.
most of us prefer that first one.
Right.
So there is, I do think there's a little bit of a psychological attempt here to cope with what's happening. Actually feels maybe better on some level that if it was my fault, then maybe I just have to change me and these bad things won't happen anymore, right? And
Yes.
it gives us a sense of power and it gives us a sense of control. But unfortunately, it gives us a sense of shame and it gives us a sense of like, right? This is literally my fault. Um, so I have a lot of empathy for that viewpoint of, that self blame. I think it comes from a place of actually trying to protect ourselves. As weird as that sounds, I really think it does come from that
I
place.
think so. I mean, from personal experience, this is just my personal experiences. Everyone's different, but there was a lot of childhood arguing amongst my parents and us children. So it always felt like I was at fault.
Yeah.
And so it was easy for me to just go, okay, can I change these behaviors so they won't fight anymore? But it wasn't me.
Right.
I wasn't the source of the fight. But
That's
there was so much of that going on. I mean, even amongst like my mother and my grandmother differed in opinions on how to raise children, and there was arguments there and so forth. So
yeah,
for me, it was easier to blame myself on everything because it
that's
seemed
right.
like that's the behavior I took from
Yes.
the trauma that was going on of the constant arguing.
That's right. Yeah. And kids are very susceptible to this because when you're a kid, you have so little control to begin with. And then you kind of couple that with like kids have this, this is, I think all kids have this way of like seeing their parents or their caregivers as like God. They are like infallible beings. Even
Mhm.
if they harm me, they're still God. So anything God says goes, right?
Right.
Because again, we're wired to attach and we've got to attach to these people. We've got to connect to these people. And so if they're unhappy with me, it's not because there's something wrong with them. That's too scary to think about.
Right.
That's because there's something wrong with me, and so we kind of internalize that and can carry that with us through life.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Rachel, in closing, is there anything you would like to say to our listeners here at the end that you'd like them to know before we go?
Yeah, I think I said this earlier, but I really feel strongly about it. That really you said this too, we are oriented towards healing. Our brain is always working towards healing ourselves, and so healing is possible, and actually in most cases I would say it's probable, right? It's very likely. We have such good tools for helping people overcome PTSD, overcome these symptoms that come from bad things that happened. So, yeah, I think that would be it. Healing is 100% possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rachel, for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you for the work you do to change lives. And
Yeah.
wonderful. So that's the end of this episode of Through the Eyes of Survivors. You see across the bottom of the screen ways you can help support us. Please donate. Follow us on Instagram, BTSADV. We also have a YouTube channel. The podcast is called Through the Eyes of Survivors. Shop our store. And next week is going to be huge. We're going to be diving into the Gabby Pito documentary. and
Ooh,
other explosive topics on our uncensored
fun.
episode. So we'll be talking about, like, was justice truly served in
Mm,
Gabby's case, and what do the red flags reveal, and what were the law enforcement failures, of course. And so you don't want to miss out on that conversation. And join us live next Wednesday, 5 p.m. Central Time. Until then, stay safe and strong and continue to break your silence. Thank you.